Hello, and welcome to Once Upon a Time in the Park Storytime. My name is Megan Gardner, and I'm so glad that you could join us today. The story I'm sharing today is Because of Winn-Dixie. This was written by Kate DiCamillo, and it's a chapter book, so I'm going to read a chapter from it for you guys. So there are no pictures. All right, I'm going to read Chapter 2. That summer, I found Winn-Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so, in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that's how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name. And I told him how I had just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. But you know what? I told Winn-Dixie. You're a suffering dog too. So maybe he will take you in right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. Winn-Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs, and I'll have to admit, he stunk bad. He was an ugly dog too, but already I loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park. And the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Miss Detweiler's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him when we got to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at the little fold-out table. He had paper spread out all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he was thinking hard. Daddy, I said. He said back. Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves? He said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know it, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn-Dixie! Winn-Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right on the preacher's lap, right on up top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at his ribs and at his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up like I said. The dog smelled pretty bad. When Dixie looked up at the preacher, he pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. "What do you call this dog?" the preacher asked. "Winn-Dixie," I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. "Well," said the preacher, "he's a stray if I'd ever seen one." He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind the ears, and a less fortunate too, that's for sure. "Are you looking for a home?" the preacher asked, real soft to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. "Well," the preacher said, "I guess you've found one." And that's the end of chapter 2. So, did you hear where Opal lived? Opal lived in a trailer park. She lived in a trailer park in Naomi, Florida. And so, a trailer park resembles, when you look on top, all the trailers in a row, and in columns resemble an array model, which is a third grade math strategy. So, here's a chart. So it says math strategies. An array model is a set that shows equal groups in rows and columns. So here we have our rows and our columns going up and down. So our rows always represent the amount of groups. So how many groups are there? And the columns represent in each group. So if you look at the front of a multiplication sentence, the first number is always the number of rows, or the number in each group, or the number of groups. And the second number, the times 3, is the number in each row. So 3, which is 3 rows, times 3 in each group equals 9. And that is our total. So if you look at the game I've created for the students today, is multiplication using array models. So for this activity, you can either create your own array models if you don't have a printer at home, or I've created some for you, some views of our trailer park from above. So it's a matching game. So I would have this picture. So I see that it's 2 groups or 2 rows. And I see that there are 3 in each row. So there's 2 rows, and 1, 2, 3 in each row. Now I look at my number cards and I think, which one of my cards matches this array? Which equation? Is it the 2 times 3 or the 5 times 4? Well, we would say, well, the first number in a multiplication equation represents our groups or our rows. So that would be 2. So I would know that this multiplication equation would match this array. So I have 2 times 3, so 2 rows times 3 in each row, and that ultimately equals 6. And we can solve that by counting. So we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so while I'm making my matches, I have a recording sheet. You can record and draw the multiplication equation and then draw the array. And like I said, if you do not have accessibility to a printer, you can draw these at home. Or if you like to play outside, you could go outside and break apart sticks and create arrays using those sticks, and have your child tell you how many groups and how many in each group, and you can make a multiplication equation that way. So thank you so much for joining me today as we read Because of Winn-Dixie. I'm Megan Gardner, and I thoroughly enjoyed you being here with me today. I hope that you enjoyed our time together too. Today's story time was brought to you by Once Upon a Time in the Park Storytime.